Hello, doctor. My name is Zhang Kexuan. The topic I'm researching is predictive analysis of credit risk on bank performance in China. I will present my research from the following 6 parts: abstract, problem statement, research objectives, methodology, discussion, and conclusion. Let me start from abstract. The main purpose of this study is to predict and analyze the impact of credit risk on performance of Chinese banks, and to help banks establish and improve their credit risk management by analyzing the degree of impact. In this study, I collected 15 years of data from 42 listed Chinese banks, selected return on assets and return on equity as dependent variables, selected non-performing loan ratio, credit deposit ratio, and capital adequacy ratio as independent variables, and constructed a multiple linear regression model. This article used a fixed effect model for empirical testing. Then is problem statement. According to the data of the World Bank, it can be seen from the figure that almost all regions have non-performing loan problems, but China's NPL in recent years is still at a high level among the world's major economies. For banks, a lower credit-to-deposit ratio means that banks retain more deposits as liquidity reserves. As shown in figure, the credit-to-deposit ratio of most banks in China is at a high level. In this case, banks may face greater risk when facing some special situations. As can be seen from figure, the capital adequacy ratio of China's banks is generally on an upward trend and is at a healthy level. Although regulators require banks to maintain a certain capital adequacy ratio, banks cannot overshrink the scale of credit, which negatively affect economic development. Therefore, it is very important to study these 3 issues. With the continuous evolution of the financial markets, commercial banks face increasingly complex risk issues, and credit risk is the risk that can easily and most likely lead to bank failure. Therefore, it is necessary to study the relationship between credit risk and bank performance. At present, most of the research on the impact of credit risk on bank performance in China focus on qualitative analysis and less on quantitative analysis. At the same time, most of the existing literature focus on the impact of commercial credit risk on corporate performance in other countries and regions, and there is fewer studies in China. Therefore, this study will fill the gap in the existing literature on the study of Chinese bank credit risk, and this study focuses on Chinese listed banks, which will also supplement China's research on the risks of listed banks. Next is research objectives. There are 3 objectives. The number 1 is based on the panel data of listed banks in China, building a model to effectively measure bank performance and credit risk. The number 2 is examine the influence and correlation of the 3 independent variables on the 2 dependent variables. The number 3 is provide valuable management suggestions for banks. Then let's turn to methodology. The first is variable selection. This paper refers to the existing literature and selects return on assets and return on equity to represent the performance level of banks. Use non-performing loan ratio, capital adequacy ratio, and credit deposit ratio to represent bank credit risk indicators, and add bank size, bank interest growth rates, and inflation rates as control variables. Then a simple selection. This paper used 42 A-share listed commercial banks in China as samples. The total assets of these banks account for nearly 80% of the entire bank industry in China, so the sample is representative. All data in this paper are annual data, including 15 years. Then let's see the discussion. The regression result shows that for the model with ROA as dependent variable and the non-performing loan ratio, capital adequacy ratio, credit deposit ratio are significant in predicting the return on assets of banks. Among them, the non-performing loan ratio is negatively correlated with ROA, while capital adequacy ratio and the credit deposit ratio are positively correlated with ROA. For the model with ROE as dependent variable, the non-performing loan ratio and capital adequacy ratio are significant in predicting the return on equity of banks. Among them, the non-performing loan ratio and the capital adequacy ratio are negatively correlated with ROE. Finally, let's see the conclusion. From the empirical result, we conclude that the first is an increase in the non-performing loan ratio is expected to lead to a decline in bank performance. The second is the higher the capital adequacy ratio, the higher the expected return on assets of banks. But the higher the capital adequacy ratio, the lower the expected return on equity of the bank. The third is an increase in the credit to deposit ratio is expected to lead to a decrease in the return on assets, but further research is needed to predict the impact on the return on equity. Based on the result, I would like to make the following 4 suggestions for banks. The number 1 is strengthen credit risk management. Banks should improve loan approval standards and banks should adopt advanced risk assessment techniques. The number 2 is optimize capital structure. Banks should control capital adequacy ratio. The number 3 is adjust credit structure. When formulating credit strategies, banks should consider adding loan products that can bring higher returns. The number 4 is comply with local policies and regulations. Okay, that's all. Thank you for your listening.